Washington basketball has their man. Danny Sprinkle is headed to Montlake.
You are Locked On Huskies, your daily podcast on the Washington Huskies. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back into another edition of the Locked On Huskies podcast. I'm Tomashoff. That's Lars Hanson. He writes for Inside the Huskies of Fan Nation Sports Illustrated. I'm the site editor over with Huskies Wire. Thank you for making this, whatever watch or listen of the day it is for you, as it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon here on the West Coast, and we're coming to you with huge news that Danny Sprinkle is Washington's next men's basketball coach. But before we get there, this episode is brought to you by LinkedIn. These days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. That's why LinkedIn Jobs help find the right people for your team faster and for free. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockdowncollege. Terms and conditions apply. So, Lars, like we said, whole lot of big news going on here today. We're going to start with all the Danny Sprinkle stuff, as any everydayer who's with us here on this live YouTube feed can see. We've got some other exciting news to get to as well, but we're going to start with Danny Sprinkle. Could be, or not, excuse me, not could be. That's the other news. Danny Sprinkle is Washington's next men's basketball coach. That hire was finalized on Monday morning after his Utah State Aggies were defeated by the Purdue Boilermakers on Sunday in the second round of the NCAA Tournament. But he seems to have, just right off the bat, he seems to have energized the fan base already. There just seems to be so much movement already. This seems like a fantastic hire.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of just seemed like it was always the direction it was going to go. And I know, obviously, on SI, Dan really reported, about 3 or 4 days ago, at least 2 or 3 days ago, that it was all the signs were basically pointing to it. And it was always just going to be a case of whenever they lose, then 48 hours later, they're going to announce it. It's like, you're never going to announce a coaching hire during the tournament to say, hey, like that guy that just beat Purdue, we're going to get him whenever he decides to come here. It's no, just play it out, let it happen. And I think one thing I touched on either earlier this week or last week was, and maybe it might have been off the record or off the after the show, but Zoom Diallo has never publicly decommitted. Kashmir Chavis, what is it?
Kashmir Chavis, yeah.
Kashmir Chavis. I knew it's like 2 C's, but well, he also goes by Cash, so it kind of throws you off every now and then.
Fair.
But neither of them have either asked out from their NIL or decommitted publicly. So I think it was always kind of a, hey, let's just wait for the new guy to come in. Again, Corin could still come back. Corin Johnson, who entered the transfer portal, could still come back. But either way, having both of those guys still the future of the program coming back or coming in and not publicly just automatically backing off, at least gives Danny Sprinkle a chance to, hey, let me keep some of this roster together. I'm going to bring in some guys, obviously, from the portal, and most of the team is graduating. But it just seems like this is the one that everybody wanted. So that's why nobody reacted until after the hire was made. Because sometimes it's, oh, wow, now we don't know who it's going to be. We have no idea. I'm going to back off and do whatever. I think everybody kind of knew Danny Sprinkle was the right fit. It just seemed like, especially with his dad playing at UW, playing football at UW back in the day, all the signs kind of just pointed to there's no reason why Danny Sprinkle would not take this job, even without Troy Dannon here. And I think, we'll talk about it later on, why Danny Sprinkle ended up staying for the future AD.
Right. Well, that's what I was going to say is like there's the whole Troy Dannon aspect of all this where, one of the concerns that we voiced on the show the other day was, all right, is Troy Dannon's departure at this point in time going to be enough to make Danny Sprinkle make a lap around the country and just look for some of these other openings? Like, I know Oklahoma State filled their opening the other day, and he was one of the names where it was kind of like, oh, well, maybe they would want him. Of course, they went in a different direction. We've seen just some of the bigger openings be filled already, and it just felt like exactly what you said, right? Where this was always just kind of the perfect fit between his dad's legacy here on Montlake and just everything else around that being from Pullman originally. But this is just such a great hire. And as Jackson Shore, fantastic everydayer, just said in the comments that this is the most excited he's been for UW basketball since the Jaden McDaniels and Isaiah Stewart year. And just from early gauging the reactions early on, when you look at, Isaiah Thomas and Spencer Hawes, who are 2 very vocal alumni on social media, and you just look around the program, it's just after so much mediocrity under Mike Hopkins, it's so nice and just so refreshing to look at this and say, yeah, he is bringing in a fantastic offense. It takes a little bit more time to install defense, but with everything that he's done in his last 5 seasons, whether it be at Montana State or with his 1 year at Utah State, I wrote something over on Huskies Wire a little bit earlier where I did some math, and his career record is 109-51. So and it's a Caleb DeBoer analogy, but winners win. And he's done a good job of doing that so far. And now moving to the Big Ten, which is just a necessary move for really any coach that needs to, or that wants to just continue to get a step up, where Utah State's done a really good job developing a basketball program. But it's kind of become a stepping stone in certain senses, where now in this really Big Two era where it's the Big Ten and the SEC. Danny Sprinkle did a really good job. Wow, I'm all over the place here with my Wi-Fi, huh? But Danny Sprinkle did a really good job of making the move at the right time after just a tremendous year at Utah State.
Yeah, well, I mean, the other thing, talking to your analogy about Caleb DeBoer, developers develop. Look at what he did at Montana State with, look at it, Raekwon Battle, who was at Washington under Mike Hopkins.
Who gave him a nice shout out today on Twitter too.
Exactly, and so it's one of those where you talk about Raekwon giving Sprinkle a shout out, right?
Yeah.
Just to clarify, because I did throw Mike Hopkins in there. Just because not that he wouldn't discredit shout out Mike Hopkins, but I think again, it's not just that he wins and develops, and I think that's kind of what you want to see, especially at a school like Washington, where we saw this past season Mike Hopkins go all in on the portal, right? 7-figure investment in NIL, things like that, just to win this year, and you theoretically you had a winning season. Theoretically, right? If you were plus 500, but 510 does not really count. You know, you should. This is a school, especially at a Power 5 level like Washington, where in a Power 2 level, let's be real here. I gotta stop saying that.
It's weird, man. It takes some time to adjust.
I still have to hold on to the nostalgia, you know, the early 2000s, just hold on to what still was there. But having all that, everything was kind of built for this moment for Danny Sprinkle to go from Montana State to Utah State to Washington. You're just continuing to climb up the ladder. And that's the thing, is it also happened instantly at Utah State. I know we've covered this ad nauseum on the show, but he didn't have it. Let's see if we can word this correctly for all the everydayers out there. Danny Sprinkle did not have any player on the Utah State roster that played a minute at Utah State the previous season.
Yes. Yep.
Okay. Good. Got that? Cool. Awesome.
Yep. Got it.
So again, in this day and age in college basketball, you're going to have some of that, right? Where you're going to bring in like Zoom doesn't have any college experience, Cash doesn't have any experience, right? But some of these other guys will, and you're going to have to sprinkle in that, no pun intended. I really did. I mean, that was actually zero intention in that. Like just sprinkle in some transfer, right? Just sprinkle in some experience, right?
Yeah.
Because knowing Zoom's probably a 1 or 2 year guy at most. Probably a 1 year guy for being real, but 1 or 2 year guy. It's that consistent developing, right? Seeing Raekwon and finding. I think the perfect example would be Nate Calmes, right? Where you go, Nate Calmes stays at Washington, develops to what he should be at Washington, what he should have been at Mike Hopkins next year. And so there's plenty of talent on the roster. It's just a matter of what else can Danny Sprinkle add to it to make it a tournament team. Because I could easily see the team making the tournament with the right additions next year.
Oh, you're absolutely right. And that's something we're going to get into actually in just a second. Right after a message from our friends over at Nissan, because this week's March Madness bracket highlight is brought to you by our friends at Nissan. Each week we're picking one team that stands out, a team that pushed it further than the rest, just like any of the all-new 2024 Nissan SUVs. These guys were able to take it to the next level. The North Carolina Tar Heels can only be described as an armada. This one seed is as hardcore as it gets out there, so it's no wonder they secured a spot in the Sweet 16 this Saturday, this is written wrong, against Alabama in the NCAA tournament. They're I love doing these things live. This Thursday against Alabama in the NCAA tournament, they're a favorite pick by many to make a run to the championship. That's why you can take the Nissan Rogue, Nissan Pathfinder, or Nissan Armada and go find your next big adventure. And you can do all that by shopping at nissanusa.com. And before we get back to it, we also got to give a shout out to our good friends over at FanDuel, because you can say goodbye to busted brackets, because FanDuel lets you bet on every game of the tournament, whether you're betting on a big upset or a one seed. It's time to go dancing on America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. That's $200 to use on point spreads, money lines. You can even pick who's going to win it all. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and bet on college hoops until they cut down the nets. Lars, I don't know about you, but my bracket is just completely busted at this point. So I would advise some everydayers maybe look around and maybe throw some money on the Illini over on our friends at FanDuel. So Lars, as you just said, transfer portal. Let's get into it a little bit. There's Zoom Diallo and Casper Chavis right now are the two guys from the high school class that, obviously you'd expect to try to find a way to keep around, and retaining Will Conroy is a really good way to do it, who gave him a nice little shout out on social media. We'll see if Will Conroy is somebody who continues to stay in the fold and he, hangs on after moving from Lorenzo Romar to Mike Hopkins, and now from Mike Hopkins to Danny Sprinkle. So we'll kind of see what that looks like, but going to the transfer portal is going to be key. And that's something that Danny Sprinkle did really well at Utah State.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's another promising sign where he was able to get some guys, and it's development at any level, right? Development any way you can, whether you're getting a guy that wasn't used correctly at his previous school, or if you're getting him out of the high school ranks. And I think we've seen that from Danny Sprinkle, where, like I mentioned, he took Raekwon Battle, I believe, as a sophomore, right? Because he played his freshman year at Washington. Maybe
that's correct.
And so, right. But either way, and Raekwon Battle got significantly better at Montana State. So I think when you look at what he's been able to do, not just at Utah State, but just both at Utah State and Montana State at the transfer portal, and then put it together quickly, because that's the other thing. Any coach in America can go hit up the portal for 10 dudes. That's not necessarily hard. It's getting the right 10 dudes. And then what we didn't see from Mike Hopkins this past season, but what Danny Sprinkle has shown, is actually get it to work quickly, right? Because it's one thing to say, hey, we got this great recruiting class, we got all this and that. But this isn't football where you can kind of get 2 years to build that class out, right? To play your freshman your first year and then see if they can develop in their sophomore and junior year. Basketball, by about early December, mid-January, you better be clicking on all cylinders. Not, you can still have a little bit of a hiccup. Injuries obviously don't count for that, but you need to get a running start in the March. And just under Mike Hopkins, we never saw that. Whereas Danny Sprinkle, his teams have kind of continuously usually had decent early season success, but then really when you get into conference time, that's when his team really tends to shine. And that's, again, at the end of the day, that's really all that matters, because you can lose not a majority, but you can lose some out of conference games. But then if you only lose 3 or 4 or 5 conference games, then you're fine, right? Because then you're probably in that 27-7, whatever you want to call it, where you're still in the ballpark to make the tournament. And also then moving to the Big Ten, you're going to face some tougher competition, right? So it's a matter of, can you match that competition quickly? And I have no doubt Danny Sprinkle will be able to identify the talent in the portal, because let's be real. I mean, already we've seen a ton of action in the portal with top 50 players. So I have no doubt that there's going to be enough available talent to make that work.
And then when you just kind of combine that with the donor factor that Washington can have, and that we know was a big factor in putting this last team together, he's going to have a lot of resources here on Montlake too, which is something that's going to be really important. And then when you just kind of look at the way he put his last team together, having to do that now, it's something he can really take to the next level, where between a bigger donor base and just a bigger platform overall, which is what Washington is going to provide him. I feel that, there's no other way to talk about this hire than it is really exciting, because, going with the defensive guy last time in Mike Hopkins, and obviously it worked out really well at the start, and you can definitely thank Matisse Thybulle and a lot of those Romar holdovers for that. And then once he kind of really started to settle in, which is when the problems started to happen, I don't necessarily think that that's something that could happen with Sprinkle, where it's a 6-year deal. We're going to see how it all plays out, where he's not necessarily getting paid like a real top of the line conference coach, but that's something where if he's really successful right off the bat, you could start thinking about an extension. I know, Husky fans might still be a little traumatized by the way the Mike Hopkins thing worked out, but if he is really successful off the bat, you have to start thinking about that possibility. And a lot of that's going to come with the athletic director, which we're going to get to in a minute. But Lars, when you kind of look around, are there any players that you think would be just really important for Danny Sprinkle to go out and get that are in the portal right now, outside of Corin Johnson, who we know has entered in his name?
Well, I mean, I was going to say, I think from a UW perspective, Corin's really the only one, obviously the only one to enter the portal. But I do think, there's a number of even West Coast guys where you look at Stojakovic's kid at Stanford. There's some other, there's some shooters out there. There's some bigs. I know Michigan had a guy enter the portal. So it's I would say for Danny Sprinkle, that one's kind of hard, because again, he doesn't even theoretically know what the roster is going to look like right now. Just in the sense of you have Frank Kepnon, who has eligibility. You have, I believe Braxton doesn't have a year left.
Right. I think Braxton has one more year.
Right. I wasn't sure if he had a grad year left or not, but either way. So then you got to answer the question. Well, obviously we would love to keep Frank, but what's his health at?
Right.
Braxton, can he fit in my defense? So I think it's more about assessing the roster and then going from there, because there's going to be about 100 or 200 more kids enter the portal between now and the end of March. So
so
to me, it's not a matter, like, I truly off the top of my head couldn't tell you more than 10 kids in the portal, just because that portal is so stacked. But I do think the one thing that I do want to kind of just summarize the whole Sprinkle hire with, that is the antithesis of Mike Hopkins. He's been a head coach and a proven head. So you're getting a proven guy. That's why it feels more like, that's why the buy-in's been so much more like, hey, this is awesome. We actually finally have a head coach. It's not a guy who's, no offense, just been a long time assistant, but you're kind of banking on, hey, well, he learned from Jim Boeheim. It's like, well, no, Danny Sprinkle learned from a bunch of coaches, but he's Danny Sprinkle. Like, he is who he is, right? He's himself. Sure. He's not, oh, hey, I'm bringing this 20 years of existence at one school. It's like, I don't really, because the more you think about that aspect of it, the more it gave me pause. So with Sprinkle, it's like, look, he's done it everywhere. He's going to do it at Washington. He just needs to get some time to feel out that roster, and then he'll add some guys in the portal.
No, you're absolutely right. Now, that's something where, the one player that I really look at, because I'm sure he's going to try to bring a couple guys from Utah State with him. The one who I'm really looking at right now is Great Osabor, where he won Mountain West Player of the Year and was just a really integral part in helping them get to just a fantastic record. What was it, 28-7, something like that, where they had a really fantastic year overall. And just, that's the kind of guy where I don't necessarily think he's Keon Brooks in that sense, but you can kind of utilize him in a similar way. And just when you look at it, Washington's going to have a really fantastic backcourt with Zoom Diallo and Caspian Chavis, assuming they stay on board, with Nate Calmes, with some of these other guys, and Wesley Yates, assuming he's able to come back as well. That's a name we haven't really brought up just yet. But if all these guys are able to come back, really what's going to be most important is just stacking the front court. And, Wilhelm Breidenbach could be one of those names where he was effective in spurts this year. And you talked about Braxton Mia, you talked about Frank Kepnong, but if there are a couple other guys, I think that he would probably be the first name that I look at and say, all right, well, obviously he already has a connection with Danny Sprinkle. If you can bring in him and one or two other guys that can just be, you don't necessarily need stars, right? You just need a couple of guys that can fill a role here, fill a role there, and go from there.
Kareem Abdul-Jabbar.
The Indiana State kid?
Yep. I mean, I think he's got eligibility left. I'm pretty sure he's got at least a couple of years left, so we'll see.
Yeah. No, and I think that's just kind of, just to wrap this all up, one thing that we should really focus on is the assistant coaching staff as well. Where, who's he going to bring with him? These are some of the big questions. Where, who's he going to bring with him? Will Conroy stay? Will Quincy Pondexter stay? I have a feeling it's going to be a nice mix of guys he knows and maybe some guys that will be able to help integrate him into just the Seattle system.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think the more we talk about it, it's kind of like you can keep one of, we've mentioned it numerous times on the program, right? You can keep one of Quincy Pondexter or Will Conroy. And I think of those two, no offense to Quincy, you would just take Will Conroy because of the Zoom dollar collection. And I think there's a way to make that work. Because if you look at it, Andy Hill was the guy that he had at Montana State, brought with him to Utah State. So clearly there's probably a couple of guys where he's going to want to bring with him. But I do think, to your point, there's obviously you need at least one guy with ties to the program just to kind of smooth it over. And I think that's the other side of it too, where sometimes coaches always bring guys. It's like, well, hey, maybe now and then it's good to bring most, but not all, right? Maybe bring 2 out of 3 or 3 out of 4, right? Just let one. You can have one, not fall guy, but kind of one guy that just, hey, you know what? I'm going to keep this guy here instead of bring you over because Sprinkle's got his family connections, but I think just having a true natural connection, and again, you don't want to say it outright, but to keep Zoom Diallo, would you just hire Will Conroy? I think that's a fair trade.
You're right. And I mean, like, of course, the Quincy connection with Wesley Yates is something where maybe that's a big reason, but who knows what that's going to look like, right? Well, there's so much to consider there. And then the one name on the outside that's been floated a lot is Tony Bland, where I know he's with San Diego State for a while. And just that's an interesting case, which is definitely going to be something for another day. But that's a name to kind of keep in mind that's been floated throughout this process, where already kind of sounded like he was in the process of putting together a staff at some point because this has been floating around in the ether for weeks at this point, and it was just finally made official today. So there's probably been some work that's been done on the back end, but I'm just really curious to see how this all plays out, because there's so many moving parts when it comes to roster construction, when it comes to just the coaching staff, where it's just so different from, what most of the show is when we talk about the football team. So there's a lot to be just to think about here. And now, Lars, we're going to move into something and somebody that I know you're very familiar with, because Washington seems to have a shot at Washington State Athletic Director Pat Chun as their next AD. But first, we got to give a shout out to our good friends over at LinkedIn, because when you're hiring for your small business, you want to find quality professionals that are right for the role. That's why you can check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs has tools to help find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. And now that those openings on UW are down to 1, so you really like to see that. And hey, shout out to LinkedIn in whatever way, shape, and form you want to give it to them. LinkedIn isn't just another job board. LinkedIn has a vast network of more than 1 billion professionals, which makes it the best place to hire. It gives you access to professionals you can't find anywhere else. LinkedIn does all that while making the process easy and intuitive. Hiring is easy when you have that many quality candidates. So easy, in fact, that 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. LinkedIn knows that small businesses are wearing so many hats and might not have the time or resources to hire. LinkedIn is constantly finding ways to make the hiring process easier. They even just launched a feature that helps you write job descriptions, making the process even easier and quicker. You can post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockdowncollege. That's linkedin.com/lockdowncollege to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. So, Lars, I put it out on Huskies Wire a little bit earlier today, because there have been a lot of rumors flying around. I swear I had 4 or 5 different people call or text me at some point today and just be like, hey, you should keep an eye on the name Pat Chun. So perfect timing for us to be able to do all this. And we were getting some questions about, well, hey, who and any info on who the next AD might be. And you, as a Wazoo grad, you know a lot about Pat Chun. So I'm just going to hand the floor over to you.
Yeah, so I personally have been a fan of Pat Chun since I was at Wazoo in about 2017. Just a good dude, great donor guy that, in terms of donor relations and able to, build things up and things like that. He's done everything he could do at Washington State. Like, his hands were pretty much tied over there. So I wouldn't judge that. I don't want to say, like, if Pat Chun ends up being the hire, which I would not be surprised to your point. But if just to caveat that really quick, if I would not judge him on Wazoo's inability to find a conference. I would not judge him on what happened with all of that fallout, because that truly was not on him. Pat did the best that he could. But from a AD perspective, from a person perspective, you can't do much better than Pat Chun. I mean, he's well regarded across the college athletic director landscape, right? I mean, he's been integral in the CFP, done stuff like that. He's almost kind of been a Troy Dannon-esque role in that, where they both kind of have their pulse on the footprint of college football and things like that. Pat, again, being an Ohio State guy, he knows the Big Ten well. So I think this would be a fantastic fit from that regard. And I do think one thing that I was thinking about when they hired Troy Dannon was, well, Pat Chun is actually a perfect fit. I just don't know if you can pull him right now. And I say that because I would say that at the time because, well, mid-season, they still couldn't really find a home. They always still needed to get sorted out and all that sort of stuff. This kind of opened the perfect opportunity when Troy Dannon left to go to Nebraska abruptly. Hey, you know what? Why not go get Pat? He's the perfect fit for this. And for people that want to say, oh, hey, well, who's going to hire a kook? Well, look, if he's good at his job, which he is,
he's very good.
That's all. I was going to say, that's all that really requires. He's never been screw you, dub, or he's never really been that kind of guy, right? And when you get to meet him in person, he's just such a great dude. I remember at Patch on Media, I just walked right up to him. We started having talks about Mike Leach and the future of the program and the athletics program. He's just that kind of guy where he's very approachable. People will easily like him. I don't think there will be that element that Troy Dannon had where maybe he kind of rubs some people the wrong way. I think he's not just a no nonsense guy, because he does like to, kind of mix it up where it's like he can have a good, fun conversation, but then there's also business that has to be had. So I think if Washington's able to secure this, which I think, with Kyle Smith going to Stanford, everything happening at Washington State, this is the perfect time for Pat to say, hey, look, I stayed all the way through. I did what I could. This opportunity opened. I would be a fool not to take it. That's just the plain and simple truth.
So I looked at this from a kind of a numbers perspective for a couple of reasons. The first thing that I looked at was his contract at Washington State, where Troy Dannon got an insane offer to go to Nebraska that you and I talked about on the show, where he's going to be making $1.6 million. There are all these different figures at stake where Pat Chun is going to be making anywhere from $850,000 to $900,000 this year. With aside any bonuses or anything like that. And that's a number that Washington could very easily up. But on top of that, one figure that I looked really closely into is in the 5 years before Pat Chun arrived at Washington State, Wazoo fundraised a total of $55.3 million, or 57.3, excuse me. In the 5 years after he arrived, that number tripled. That number went to 155.3. So he did a fantastic job fundraising. And we heard, we heard all the rumors about Troy Dannon saying Washington's broke, this and that. Whether those things are true or not, Pat Chun has proven to be an incredible fundraiser over his time at a school where, especially with all the things that are going on over there right now, they need as much money as they possibly can get. And Pat Chun did a really great job of going out there and doing that. So that's one figure that really stands out to me in terms of NIL, in terms of some of the other things that are really important in the ever-changing landscape of, let's be real here, as important as college athletics are as a whole, the main point of this is college football. And when you look at this from a college football perspective, if he can continue to infuse money into the football program and maybe try to find a way to keep Jedd Fisch around or do some of these other things, then this could turn out really well.
Right, exactly. It's almost like all the pieces are in place for Pat Chun to just hit a home run at Washington. I mean, think about what you just said, right? I know I'm just saying for the everydayers. He tripled Wazoo's investment in Pullman. Right next to the Idaho border. This isn't like you had Seattle to play off of or Vegas to play off of or whatever you want to call it. He didn't have anything to build off of, and he tripled, to your point, the ROI. So for me, it's imagine putting that in Seattle. That's all I'm going to say. Just think about what, to your point, we don't think UW is broke, right? Again, there are some numbers that they're not Arizona, right? They're not the $200 million didn't just go missing. But with that being said, having Pat with the ties of Seattle, he will without question hit a home run in that regard, because think about this, where he's a known fundraiser and then you get a big market in Seattle with all the ties and boosters that UW has and everything that's involved with the athletic department and Tie Club and all that. It's a perfect fit. And if you think about it, when you're looking at the situation that he's had in Pullman, where he's had Jake Dickert, Kyle Smith, people have wanted to either pluck guys from him, or it's kind of been like we're trying to fend people off. At Washington, now you kind of get to be the one that not does the picking, but you really kind of get to settle in at Washington. And again, the only reservation that I will have about this hire, even that I talked with you about this off the air, even though Ohio State did fill their 80 role after Gene Smith left, Pat Chun is an Ohio State guy. That's always been kind of one of those suspected at some point, somehow he wants to go back to Ohio State, but the happy medium is, well, why not get another Big Ten job at Washington, where I don't have to go across the country, move my family, do all this. I just kind of move across the state, and I get to go to the Big Ten. So that in, let's say, 5 or 7 years, if Ohio State's AD job opens up again, Pat can say, hey, I did this at Washington. Why not go to Ohio State? And Washington fans, I think at that point would forgive him, because again, going to your alma mater,
that's a very different story than leaving after less than 6 months to do that. Where it's. You can think about it in a similar way of Jen Cohen taking the USC job, where, obviously she grew up a UW fan, although all those, this, that, and the third thing when it comes to that particular case. But with Pat being somebody that grew up in Ohio, and he might want to have that bigger time experience before he can even have a chance at that job. Where, of course, if they wanted him in this last go around and he just said, no, I want to stick it out here, that's one thing. But it kind of looks like he might need a little bit more experience at that Big Ten level, where, as you said, it's a much easier move for him to say, all right, yeah, I'd like to go to Ohio State at some point, but let me make sure that I can prove myself over at Washington on the same stage and then go to Ohio State and make that move.
Exactly. And especially coming off what happened at Washington State, which again, I will go to my grave saying that's not Pat Chun's fault. Pat, there ain't nothing he could do about that. He did as much as he could. He did what he could. Let me put it that way. And to your point, he fundraised the hell out of his time in Pullman. But there's just certain schools where you're kind of having to return over guys, as coaches and things like that, because other schools want to take them. When you're now at Washington, you don't have that problem. You can truly establish yourself. There's no world in where I see Pat Chun leaving in less than a year or even 2 years. I would put the over under at 3.5, and I'd probably take the over. I could see him leaving after 4 or 5, but not after 2.
Right. Because it like you said, it all comes down to a very specific case of, all right, is this one job open? And if it's not, then maybe he'd continue to stay around. And Lars, with that being said, probably a good time for us to get out of here. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you to all the everydayers for tuning in. We really do appreciate your constant support. Really does mean a lot to us. And, just a quick scheduling update with us doing this show on Monday afternoon. We're going to be coming at you again on Wednesday. So make sure you tune in for that because we've got so much fun stuff. We got a special guest coming on at some point this week to help us break down everything before the pro day. So again, make sure you tune in. And the best way to do that is make sure you subscribe wherever you get your podcast, whether it's YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music. We're there. We're everywhere, updating the channel with new content every single day. So please make sure you hit that like button, hit that little bell so you never miss it when we post a new video or when we go live like this. And make sure to leave us a comment down below if you have any questions, comments, concerns, anything like that. And if you're audio only, please leave us a 5-star review, as it all really does help the show out a lot. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we will talk to you on Wednesday.